Suddenly, scorching hot tea splashed across my face. The sharp, stinging pain hit me instantly, leaving me frozen in shock. As I wiped the burning liquid off, I looked up to see my mother-in-law, Amy, standing there, holding the empty cup in her hand. Her face was expressionless, cold and distant, as though she had meant to do it. I was trying to process what had just happened, but the shock left me speechless. This wasn't the first time Amy had pushed the boundaries, but I was certain it would be the last. Her icy eyes met mine, and as her harsh voice pierced the silence, I knew I'd reached my breaking point. My name is Cheryl, and I'm 35 years old. What started as a hopeful marriage to Scott has turned into a daily battle, one not only with him but also with his mother, Amy. Scott and I met in college, both pursuing degrees in business administration, dreaming of successful careers in finance. 5 years ago, we were filled with hope as we got married, ready to start a life together. But 5 months ago, Scott lost his job and everything changed. Since then, I've been working hard in the finance world, making a steady income of around $80,000 a month through stock trading. It's enough to cover our household expenses, but for Amy, it's never enough. She never fully approved of me, and since Scott's job loss, her resentment has only intensified. Despite my financial support, covering the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and more, Amy continued to demand more. Her latest request was that I contribute an additional $5,000 monthly, even though I was already shouldering every bill on my own. One morning, after Scott left for what I hoped would be a promising job interview, Amy cornered me in the kitchen. She sat at the table, sipping her tea and glaring at me as I cleaned the counters. Her words were laced with hostility as she said, "You think just because you're earning some money, you don't have to pay your share?" I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my calm. "Amy, I am covering all the bills. What more could you possibly want?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Without missing a beat, she snapped, "I want you to contribute $5,000 more each month." She said it as if this was the most reasonable request in the world. I shook my head, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I'm already paying for everything, Amy. I don't have anything more to give," I replied firmly, though I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. Her gaze narrowed, and she hissed, "Then maybe you should think about leaving. If you can't pull your weight, you don't belong in this house." Her words stung, but they also solidified what I'd known for a long time. I was no longer welcome here. Amy was unwilling to accept me as part of the family, and her demands were only a reflection of her resentment. In that moment, I realized that I needed to make a decision not just for myself, but for my own peace of mind and self-respect. This was no longer just a struggle for acceptance. It was about reclaiming my sense of worth and finding a life free from this constant battle. That day, I finally decided I would no longer let Amy's disapproval define my life. I was ready to take a step towards a future where I could be truly happy, even if it meant leaving behind the life I had worked so hard to build. I was the one holding everything together in our household, not Scott. Yet, Amy had the nerve to demand even more from me. My patience finally snapped. "I'm not the one slacking here, Amy," I said firmly. "Maybe you should be asking your son to contribute before coming after me." That's when she lost it. In a flash of anger, Amy jumped up, grabbed her cup of tea, and threw it directly at my face. The scorching liquid hit my skin, but the shock and hurt from the vicious act cut even deeper. I stumbled back, stunned and silent, as she stormed off, muttering about how ungrateful I was and how I didn't deserve to be in her family. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay in that house another day. That night, I packed my things and left. Scott wasn't home, probably at another unsuccessful job interview, I guessed. I didn't wait for him to return. I went back to my parents' house, feeling a mix of exhaustion, relief, and sadness. Days passed, and I didn't hear a single word from Scott. No call, no message. At first, I was surprised. I had expected at least some kind of apology or explanation. But as the weeks went by, it became clear to me that I meant very little to him, or at least far less than his mother did. A month passed, and my feelings for Scott began to shift. What once was love faded into a sense of clarity. I realized I couldn't return to a marriage where I was constantly devalued and manipulated. I began to consider divorce seriously, finally accepting that my happiness and self-respect were more important than holding on to a broken relationship. One early morning, the doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the monitor and was stunned to see Scott and Amy standing outside. They looked exactly the same as the last time I'd seen them, as though nothing had changed. "What now?" I muttered, feeling my frustration rise. Reluctantly, I pressed the intercom button. "Yes? What can I do for you?" I asked, keeping my tone calm despite the growing frustration inside me. Amy's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and sharp. "I've forgiven you, Cheryl," she declared, as if bestowing some grand favor. "Come back home now." My eyebrows shot up. "Forgiven me?" I repeated, both confused and angry. For what, exactly? I hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, acting as if she had power over me. Without another word, I ended the call and stepped away from the door, my heart racing with anger. But they didn't leave. Instead, they started banging on the door, their voices growing louder and more insistent. "Don't just hang up on us. Let us in," Amy shouted. Not wanting to disturb my parents or the neighbors, I reluctantly opened the door, deciding it was better to hear them out and bring this ordeal to a close. Scott and Amy stepped inside, and I motioned for them to sit on the living room sofa. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever confrontation awaited me. I was done being trampled. This time, I was determined to get the answers I deserved. I took a steadying breath and faced them both directly. "What do you want?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Amy leaned forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You need to come back," she declared, her tone dismissive. "It's time to stop acting like a child and return to your responsibilities." My jaw clenched at her words. "You told me to leave, Amy. I left because of you. Now, you expect me to come back like nothing happened?" My voice was calm, but I could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Our conversation quickly turned heated. Amy accused me of abandoning Scott and my duties to the household, while I reminded her of the mistreatment and constant hostility I had endured under her roof. The argument rose to a fever pitch, voices overlapping until, finally, Scott broke his silence. His voice was soft and unsteady. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." Amy turned to him, her anger momentarily subsiding. "What is it?" she demanded. Scott looked down, avoiding her eyes. I've been out of work for months now, Mom. Cheryl was the one supporting us all along. I wasn't contributing anything." Amy's face twisted in shock and disbelief. "What do you mean? You told me everything was fine." Scott sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't want you to worry. I thought I'd find something soon, but I just didn't." His excuse only seemed to enrage Amy further. She exploded, her anger shifting entirely onto Scott. "So you've been lying to me? Relying on her while sitting around doing nothing?" She glared at him, her voice dripping with disappointment. As I watched them unravel, a strange calm washed over me. This was exactly the toxic environment I had escaped, and I knew I couldn't return. Quietly, I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers I had been holding onto for weeks. I placed them in Scott's hands, his eyes widening in shock as he stared down at the documents, uncomprehending. "Cheryl, this is too sudden," he finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you think we should at least talk about this?" I shook my head, feeling a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. "I've had weeks to think about it, Scott. You didn't reach out once. You didn't care. Your mother has treated me terribly, and you've stood by, letting it happen. I won't go back to that house, Scott." Amy jumped to her feet, fury flashing across her face. "You think you can just walk away after everything we've done for you?" she sneered. I met her gaze, unwavering. "Done for me?" I scoffed. "Amy, you've made my life miserable from the day I moved in. I was the one supporting the household while Scott was out of work, and yet you still demanded more from me. I won't let either of you take advantage of me anymore." Scott's face turned red, a mix of frustration and desperation. You can't just give up on our marriage because of a few arguments with my mom. This isn't just a few arguments, Scott, I said firmly. It's a pattern of disrespect, manipulation, and indifference. I needed your support, and instead, you let your mother tear me down over and over. I refuse to keep sacrificing my happiness for a marriage that only hurts me. For a moment, Scott said nothing, looking between me and his mother, perhaps realizing for the first time how deeply this had affected me. But it was too late. I had given everything I had, and now all I wanted was peace. Without another word, I stood up and walked toward the door, leaving them both to grapple with the reality of my decision. For the first time in a long time, I felt free to rebuild my life on my own terms, without the constant weight of someone else's judgment or demands. And I knew I was ready to face whatever came next. I looked at Scott, my voice unwavering. You stood by and watched while your mother verbally and emotionally tore me down. You never defended me, never stood up for me, and now, when I needed you the most, you didn't even check if I was okay. Amy's face twisted with fury, disbelief evident in her eyes. Ungrateful woman. After everything I've done for you, keeping this house running, allowing you to live here, I cut her off, my tone cold. Amy, I was the one paying for everything, yet you still demanded more. The room fell silent, my words settling heavily in the air. Scott glanced between me and his mother, clearly at a loss. He knew it was true. He had relied on me, doing little to change our situation. I'm done, Scott, I said, my voice final. Sign the papers. He hesitated, his hands trembling as he held the pen. Are you sure this is what you want? He asked, his voice low, almost as if he hoped I'd reconsider. I've never been more certain of anything, I replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as he signed the papers. Amy, unable to contain her anger any longer, stormed out of the room, her voice echoing down the hallway. You'll regret this, Cheryl. You'll regret leaving us. I watched her leave, her threats fading as she disappeared down the hall. But I felt no fear, no regret, only peace. It was finally over. 5 weeks passed, and life at my parents' house felt calm and simple. The divorce papers had been filed, and I was slowly piecing together a new life. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was Amy. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone neutral even as I felt a twinge of anxiety. Cheryl, the electricity and gas have been cut off, she said, her voice edged with desperation. I know you're no longer with Scott, but could you at least help us pay the bills this month? Just until Scott finds a job. I was stunned. After everything they'd put me through, she was asking for my help. No, Amy, I replied firmly. I'm not responsible for your household anymore. Ask Scott to take care of it. She scoffed, her voice sharp. He can't. He hasn't found a job yet, and we need help. Then you'll have to figure it out, I said calmly, my hand hovering over the end call button. I'm not getting involved anymore. You can't just abandon us like this, she shouted, her voice laced with anger and desperation. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm moving on, I said, and with that, I ended the call and blocked her number. A few more months passed, and life finally began to settle into a new, fulfilling rhythm. I focused on my work, my happiness, and my goals. I was thriving, free from the weight of their constant demands. For the first time in a long time, I was building a life that was entirely mine. I received a message from Scott one day. He apologized for everything, admitting he should have defended me. He mentioned he'd finally found a job at a factory. Despite his apology, I felt no need to reconnect with him or his mother, so I blocked his number as well. I had moved on, and reopening old wounds felt pointless. About 5 months after the divorce, I met someone new. His name was Jerry, and he was kind, dependable, and respectful, everything I had hoped for but never found in Scott. We took things slowly, enjoying each other's company without rushing. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly happy and at peace. As for Amy, she finally faced consequences for her actions. After I reported the tea incident, the legal system recognized it for what it was: assault. She was charged, fined, and sentenced to community service. Scott, on the other hand, was ordered to pay spousal support, a fitting consequence for his inaction and reliance on me throughout our marriage. In the end, I had gained more than freedom from a toxic relationship. I found clarity, confidence, and a new sense of peace. My life was moving forward. I left behind the manipulation, constant criticism, and heavy expectations that had weighed on me. My career in finance continued to thrive, and I enjoyed the freedom and self-sufficiency that came with it. Occasionally, I thought of Scott and his mother, but those thoughts passed quickly. That chapter was firmly closed, and there was no going back. Jerry and I grew closer, and the connection between us felt real and easy. There were no endless demands or expectations, just mutual respect and understanding. For the first time in years, I could focus on what genuinely made me happy. One afternoon, while catching up on work at a cafe, I received an email that made my heart skip a beat. The subject line read, "Request for reconsideration of spousal support." It was from Scott's lawyer. I opened it, my heart pounding, but as I read through the contents, a calmness settled over me. Scott was appealing to reduce the spousal support payments, citing financial difficulties. He explained that his factory job wasn't paying enough to cover his living expenses and the spousal support. Additionally, he claimed Amy's health issues were straining their finances. It was clear they were hoping I would feel guilty and reconsider. But I had left that life behind, along with the guilt and manipulation. I was done playing their games. I had paid my dues, both emotionally and financially. Without hesitation, I forwarded Scott's email to my lawyer, confident that the law would support me. A few weeks later, we appeared in court. Scott and his lawyer argued that his financial situation was too strained to continue paying spousal support. He presented documents showing his minimal earnings from his factory job and highlighted Amy's increasing medical expenses. But my lawyer was prepared. She pointed out that throughout our marriage, I had been the primary and often sole financial provider while Scott contributed very little. The spousal support was fair, given the years I had spent supporting him and his mother. My lawyer also reminded the court of the toxic environment I had endured, especially mentioning Amy's assault on me. As the hearing continued, I noticed the frustration building on Scott's face. He was not used to facing the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he was being held accountable, and it clearly unsettled him. After carefully listening to both sides, the judge delivered the verdict. Scott's request to reduce spousal support was denied. Although the court acknowledged his financial struggles, they weren't enough to justify lowering the payments. The judge also noted that Amy's behavior had significantly contributed to the breakdown of our marriage and emphasized that Scott needed to take responsibility for his choices, or lack thereof. As we left the courtroom, Scott approached me, his expression a mix of frustration and desperation. "Cheryl, please can't we work something out? I'm struggling." "You don't have to do this," he pleaded. I looked at him, feeling a fleeting pang of sympathy, but quickly reminded myself of everything I had endured. "Scott, I spent years supporting you and your mother, and all I got in return was disrespect and manipulation. I've moved on. You need to figure things out for yourself." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving him behind. I wasn't angry, just relieved to finally be free from a life that had drained me of my energy and happiness. In the following months, I heard through mutual friends that Amy's health was deteriorating. She had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and Scott was struggling to care for her. While a part of me felt a twinge of sympathy, I reminded myself that their lives were no longer my responsibility. I had done my part. It was now up to Scott to step up. Meanwhile, my own life was blossoming. Jerry and I had grown closer, and we were discussing the possibility of taking the next step in our relationship. He valued my independence and supported my ambitions, qualities I had never experienced in my previous marriage. Being with someone who respected and appreciated me without trying to control or change me was refreshing and empowering. One day, as I was scrolling through the news on my phone, I realized how far I had come. My life was finally my own, filled with peace, growth, and genuine happiness. The struggles and the pain of my past seemed distant, like a closed chapter in a book. I was living fully, free from the shadows of my past, and ready for whatever new adventures lay ahead. A headline caught my eye: "Local woman sentenced for assault in tea incident." My heart raced as I clicked on the article, and there it was, an update on Amy. The case I had filed against her for throwing hot tea at me had finally come to an end. The court found her guilty of assault, sentencing her to pay a significant fine and complete additional community service. A wave of emotions hit me as I read the words. Amy had finally been held accountable. It wasn't about celebrating her downfall. It was about the peace that came with knowing justice had been served. It felt like the last piece of closure I needed. Months later, I was out to dinner with Jerry, reflecting on how far I'd come. I had walked away from a toxic marriage, faced legal challenges, and emerged stronger on the other side. I found happiness in my career, in my relationship with Jerry, and most importantly, within myself. The burdens of the past no longer weighed me down. Amy and Scott were behind me, and I was free to live on my own terms. As I smiled across the table at Jerry, I knew I was ready for whatever the future held. The painful chapters of my life had closed, and a new, hopeful one was opening. I was free, strong, and finally at peace, ready to embrace all the good things life had to offer.